What's the role of those silent objects? What do they know that we don't? What do the walls witness in the rooms of power? How do walls feel about the decisions being made within the comfort they provide? What's the role of those silent objects? What do they know about the hands using them? How do walls feel about the decisions being made within the comfort they provide?
En la sociedad capitalista, ¿qué es lo que reina? La desigualdad.
Totalitarian systems work hard to achieve a consistent look. An entanglement of signs that builds a recognizable iconography. Buildings, interiors, walls, uniforms, paintings, sculptures, graphics. A kind of fascist brand identity.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Katrin Becker, and I'm the Artistic Director of the Kindle Center for Contemporary Art. And I'm very pleased to welcome tonight two wonderful artists, Eli Cortiñas, who shows her impressive video work, Walls Have Feelings, currently in the M1 VideoSpace, and Candice Breitz, as well as Eli, an acclaimed international video artist based in Berlin. Thanks very much to both of you to be with us tonight. The work Walls Have Feelings will be in the very center of tonight's talk, and I think it will be a great opportunity for the public to get an insight into video production, video art production, and thinking. Well, of course, I would appreciate very much if we could all sit together at the Kindle and listen and talk and discuss and ask questions. And you all know why this is impossible tonight. But I would like to remind you that we have the live chat function on YouTube, where you might ask questions that we later on can discuss in our Q&A at the end of Eli's and Candice's conversation. Well, have a great time now. I look very much forward. Dear Eli, dear Candice, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katrin, for the warm introduction. And such a pleasure, really, to be here to discuss Eli's work tonight. I think we'll just jump right in. Eli, I must say that the title of the work, before one even experiences it, is already very, very evocative. I know that you are a very multilingual thinker. For those of us who think in English, the more common expression would be, if walls had ears. One would often say, if only the walls had ears, what they would hear. And what's so interesting about your title is that it suggests that these walls in which things... Title of the work before one... Sorry? Katrin?
You can keep going, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I heard Katrin, so I wasn't sure. What's so interesting about the title is it moves us away from this idea as architecture and walls as innocent bystanders, as passive listeners to what's taking place within them. And it gives a more affective twist to that expression. Walls have feelings. You declare walls have feelings, and you suggest that walls might be somehow complicit, implicated in some way in what takes place within them. So I thought maybe we could open by just sharing about this title and the way that it kind of leads us into the work.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Candice. And thank you so much, Katrin, for inviting us and setting this up. I think that there are many, yes, I mean, we have this expression in Spanish, I think, as well. And so it is interesting for me to hear that it is also in English like that. I didn't know that, I have to be quite honest. I have to, disappoint you maybe a little bit because I didn't come up with the title. It's the title of a book, but that's something that we might go into a little bit later, because basically what I was interested in when I approached this project, if one has like one focus, because it's always like, all over the place and it's very fragmented. But I think that what I was most interested in when it came to walls is because the wall is an object that is traditionally already symbolizing so much, it really already carries so much information and so much historicity to it. Actually, it is separation, it is private and public, it is legality, it is also shelter, but it's also nation, borders, and so on and so on. So in some way, I was very interested to work with this object because it is a construction that is already so incredibly loaded. But at the same time, I was maybe more interested at the very beginning not to see the walls for what they stand for or what they witness, but like looking, especially because the work that we're going to be talking about starts with the interior walls of dictators' offices and these spaces that we historically somehow know and are very attached. But I was very interested in looking at interrogating how those walls or how those objects can actually be activated, how they can be taken away from this very passive sort of witness, stand, as you were talking about, and if they would have an agency and a feeling and a possibility of developing own ideas on their own. And I think the root of all of that is actually in my interest for a more not anthropocentric worldview. It has also the root on a story that was told to me by a wonderful Peruvian friend of mine who's an artist as well, Andrea Canepa, and she told me about this incredible culture in Peru, like ancient culture that we call the Moshe culture, and they used to have this incredible potteries and this incredible signs. They didn't have a written language, but they have a very complex compilation of signs in which they used to represent calendars, mythologies, rituals, and everything. And they used to put it on the incredible ceramics that they did out of mud, but also on the walls of their temples and so on. And they have this incredible belief that one day those same objects that they had created in order to improve their life would take revenge on the human. So they have these depictions on the ceramics, they have the depictions on the walls. You can see these anthropomorphic, incredible figures, like you can see a piece of clothing, like very anthropomorphic, taking revenge on a human being with a weapon. You can see them actually riding them like horses or using them as objects, the human being used from the object. So I was very fascinated about this idea of the technology that you create as a human taking revenge on you, and actually you realizing that putting the human at the center of all understanding and all possibilities of knowledge building, it's just not what it is, So that, I would say, that was one of the departing places, but there were so many more. I would say also there was a book that was very defining for the Walls Have Feelings, and it was not the book called Walls Have Feelings, it was a book called The Third Reich of the Dreams, the Dritte Reich des Traumes by Charlotte Beradt, which was a Jewish journalist living in Germany during the Nazi period, and she was compilating 300 dreams actually by very different people, you know, during that time. And she was compiling them and collecting them before she had to actually escape to the US and go into exile. And she managed to collect them. And the interesting thing about those dreams, and that's something that I'm very interested on because it's about the subconscious, you know, is that you can see that under totalitarian regimes, the certain type of objects and bureaucracy and certain types of technology appear over and over again. So I think that to summarize the book, which is an incredible book, is actually to say that the only thing that differs one totalitarian or oppressive system from the other, or ideologies, fundamentalist systems from one another, is the type of technology that appears in the dream. But if you take that aside, everything else is like kind of a sign. There are signs, iconographies, and certain ideas that appear already there. So I was very interested in these areas, in anything that was a language or an approach to aesthetics and to design that was not anthropocentric, but also not ethnocentric at the same time. So it's a very long explanation, but it's like very fragmented and very, very, very connected, all of it, you know.
Well, I definitely would love to hear you speak more about, you know, your interest in animism, this idea that objects have a life of their own and that they interact with us in less passive ways than we might think. But maybe I'll keep the focus a little bit on what I consider, I think about this work as a study of power and the less obvious ways in which it manifests. So often our notions of power are connected to human agency. And I think, you know, this is such a dense piece of work. As you watch it, I've watched it now myself 3 or 4 times, and one keeps on seeing new things and learning new things. And one of the things that occurred to me on the most recent round of watching it was that this is not just about the obvious ways in which objects, whether they be architectural or not, the way that they exert power, right? So we see chisels on stone, we see fences with barbed wire, we see objects which are more obviously can be used in violent ways. But we also see a lot of surfaces which would otherwise maybe resonate as elegant, refined, tasteful. And I'm very interested in the way that this work kind of meanders between very obviously violent, implicated objects and objects which we maybe would usually regard as innocent. So we see minimal furniture, we see porcelain decorations. We see, interestingly for me, and this one is more obvious violent one, but very early on, we see Hitler seated on his desk, and next to him we see a rubber stamp. And we know exactly the ways in which those rubber stamps were used to get the whole Nazi bureaucracy to keep it going. So could you maybe speak a little bit about this kind of range of objects? It's not obvious at all where you look for the agency of objects.
Yes, well, sometimes, yeah, it's very complicated. It's very complex to speak about it because it has, of course, very many different bifurcations. You know, of course, in the one hand, as you said yourself, we see objects that we can contextualize right away, and we understand the type of meaning and symbolic and agency, and they belong to maybe like an ideology. You know, that it's very well recognizable. And sometimes we have less spectacular objects, and even decorative objects. I think it's always connected because when you go into the piece, you see that all the time the piece is kind of trying to connect how those ideologies function as containers. They function as containers in the sense that they don't need to embody just one system or one meaning. They can be just used by the next system in another way, and still we will have recognizable iconographies, we will have recognizable objects, you know. But then we have these porcelain objects typical from the European time. We have at some point, you know, you pointed out this super wax fabric that is supposed to be identity of an African continent, when in reality it was brought by Europeans there, but it's also mixed with some Rococo elements. So it's also about the idea of representation. It's related to idea. It's related with the idea of of labor behind these objects is also related to ideas of how we represent those hemispheres, that we know have that we know also that the depiction of history and representation has always been taken over by just one part of it, So somehow, I mean, it's difficult to explain, but I was very interested to look at things that seem harmless, that seem recognizable in our everyday life, because that's also the reality of all of it. I remember that there was a moment we were talking about the continuity, of these systems. You move from the colonial times and you move to industrialization, and you move to modern time, you move to all those things, but you carry on also certain objects, you carry on certain ideas, certain ideologies, that they just change a little bit the skin, but reality is they keep functioning in a certain way. So I guess I was just very interested not to show these like big items that are recognizable right away, but also to make us understand that looking at everything that is around that, looking at things that are produced industrially, that we don't have any sort of mystic relationship to it anymore, because we don't know how they appear in the world. That's the one thing. But then the other thing is also that we have to think of the production value of this. We have to think of where it has been produced. We have to think about manufacturing. We have to think about labor conditions, modern slavery, etc., etc., etc. So I was interested in showing things that would seem harmless at first, but they are, connected to an incredible, complex and intricate relationships of responsibility and actually causality, that is mostly at the end of the day ending up in this very vertical asymmetry of global north and global south, as you know. So that would be maybe a way of trying to explain a little bit those decisions.
Yeah, no, it's like, as I hear you talk, the work gets richer and richer for me, actually, because I think that what you do with this work is to offer us a filter in a way. It's hard after watching the work and engaging with it to sort of go back into normal spaces or spaces which one has occupied uncritically, without starting to look around the room and think about the origin of objects. And obviously this country has a very peculiar relationship to objects. Many people still have objects in their homes which they don't know were, taken illegally from Jewish families. There are many implicated objects that are still in circulation in the German context. I want to come back actually to questions of labor, because they're so central to the work, your analysis of labor. And certainly I think that one of the interesting things that happens is that you question the ways in which labor is concealed or disguised or made invisible. So I'm going to get there in the next question. But before I get there, I have a more technical, formal question to ask you, because one, it kind of broke my brain. I edit in fairly complex ways, but it broke my brain to try and imagine how you put something like this together. It's such an unbelievably layered and sort of deep and sort of dense montage, which happens visually, just the sheer variety of images and footage, but not only, then all of the voices that inhabit this work. You sort of in some ways you're channeling people like Mbembe and Federici and Franco Pifo Berardi, and we feel these voices in the work. And you have such a nuanced, complex way of taking all of these fragments, voices, images, footage, and weaving them together. And maybe it's just interesting for people to understand how you go about something like this. The sheer complexity of it is quite something.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I also took some time to try to understand myself what happens there, in the sense that I think that maybe the more complex the topics I work with have become, the more, of course, the research and the reading becomes really important, but not in the sense that you want to make, at the end of the day, as an artist, a display of information. You don't want to display the knowledge that you have gathered, because that would be also contrary to what I believe that knowledge is actually about, and how you gather it together, because there are also experiential moments in life that are as valuable as that sort of academic, intellectual architectural sort of work. So somehow there is something that happens in the work that I don't have a linear process in it. I start collecting material. I do something that I like to call sometimes, and I can use it for when I film myself, what I don't do a lot. For people who maybe don't know my work, I appropriate a lot of archival material, I appropriate found footage, material that is already being produced by whomever, mostly mainstream, mostly something that is accessible in the most wider sense. But I actually also film myself, and I call this method sometimes like the sort of Jonas Mekas sort of way of collecting or filming material, which means the moment I'm filming, the moment I'm collecting, I'm not putting an intention on the material, on the imagery. I'm putting an intention later when I have all together in the editing and start editing. So what happens is actually that I don't write, read, prepare, think about it, and then edit. I just go right into the montage. And because I have been an editor myself, I've been working as an editor for a long time. Also, I was an editor for documentary, which is like one of the hardest and most beautiful experience you can have, editing, because you have to deal with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of material, and there is nothing that is actually defined there. So you just have to really listen to the what the material tells you, where you should go, what you should follow. And somehow the practice shaped me so much the way I work today that I cannot have like a linear way of working. And so I start editing. I am reading, I'm putting things in, and sometimes they're quotes, but then they become paraphrasing, but then they become like a conjunction of everything that comes together. And then another thing happens, and then what happens is when you don't put the intention in the categorizing of your material, when you don't put an intention on the filming of your material, once you watch it together, then something appears that you are not even in control. You can call it aleatory, you can call it luck, but you can also call it alchemy. And this is what happens. It's an alchemist process. You know, something starts appearing that was actually not planned. And it's actually, strangely enough, going to the places that you kind of were aiming for, but something else appears. And that's actually the magic of it. It's not easy to stay open to it, and it makes the processes super long. It means I work like 1.5 years for a piece that is only 13 minutes. You know, everybody would say you're nuts, but you know, this is the reality of it, to have that sort of freedom when I go into it at some point and be able to listen to it. I have to know enough, I have to read enough, I have to watch enough, but at the same time also I have to free myself from knowledge and the construction of memory and history, which is actually this thing that I'm aiming at debunking all the time, you know. So yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but that's just like I cannot hear you, Candice.
This is somehow reassuring to me, because the final piece feels so deliberate and so tightly put together. So I somehow find it comforting that you start with this kind of messy intuition, and then that the pieces slowly fall into place. I can identify with that. But maybe that actually is a nice segue from your labor and your process to the various experiences of labor which are documented and considered in the work. So, you know, you take us into so many spaces of labor, and you're particularly interested in mass labor in this work. You take us into the sweatshop, we go into factories, you know, I think we go into a mine for a moment. We see these sort of mass office spaces. We see sculptors at work, another space of work in a studio. And what strikes me about it is that there's something incredibly banal about the way that power manifests, and often it is organized and sort of speaks through bureaucracy. Often power speaks through bureaucracy. And I thought it was very telling and very important that early on in the work, you point to systems of bureaucracy. We see filing cabinets, we see inventories, we see catalogs, we see modes of bureaucracy, which we know are at the service of power because we see them in the context of the Nazi regime. But I think that one carries one with that as one goes deeper into the work, this kind of question of the sort of banality of power as manifested through bureaucracy. So I thought maybe you could say something about this, the way that bureaucracy keeps on somehow marking the surface of the work.
I mean, it's impossible for it not to appear all the time, as our beautiful Hannah Arendt said in Banalität des Bösen. It's not just those figures that work on those positions, it's bureaucrats, but it's also the bureaucracy around it, also the type of material world that appears around it. I mean, yeah, it's difficult so to put it in just one place. I guess it just really keeps appearing. One also has to say that once you start also looking at cinematic memory, once you start looking at how this has been represented, and I mean, there is also a scene where these famous first, the inception of cinema, there was something before already, but the Lumiere workers going, the Lumiere workers coming out of the fabric, something that is also a hint to Farocchi's, of course, analysis, incredible analysis of how not just about that film and the inception of cinema, but about how cinema and media in general has actually from the very beginning portrayed workers' movement, portrayed labor. That's something that I have been very interested in my also, in a very strange way, actually even be so incredibly connected to the way ethnography in the former colonial, well, we didn't have neo-colonial times, but like in the colonial times, ethnography was treated the same way, this depiction of workers. So I have been interested maybe a lot in the depiction of how labor is actually depicted, but also how labor is invisibilized. And then there is parts in the work, we have Charlie Chaplin in modern times. I guess what I wanted to say is that once you start working with these films and you use the material, also the imageries come in, but also the thoughts behind it. And then you can not avoid but see that maybe a film like Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin is a film that is an incredible diagnostic of our times as well. You have a figure that is completely working in the middle of the industrialization, not being able to cope with the rhythm of assembly line, going to a mental hospital, then after leaving the facility being jobless, ending up in jail, and then by the moment accidentally, I mean, it's Chaplin at the end of the day, of course, accidentally he becomes a hero, so he's finally a worthy member of society, and then he decides to stay in jail. I mean, that's the point, but the diagnostic of the hospital, of the assembly lines, of the hospital and of the jail and all those spaces, we inhabit them the same way in the contemporary war and in the contemporary labor conditions. So I was very interested in trying to find a way of exposing them to one another and intertwining them almost shamelessly with one another and see what could come out of it, because there is a deep relation with them. And I guess that's actually what drives the work all the time, realizing that we know that in capitalist societies, there is when we talk about animism and not having a connection anymore to objects because we don't see how they are, because they are not created, they just appear. So they have just a function, they're objectified in the most literal sense. But at the same time, when we look at, now I lost track. I wanted to say something else. I lost track. Well, I'm just saying that it's very common to this type of capitalist societies to invisibilize anything that comes into our hands. We know the garment industry is one of those, but also when we look into artificial intelligence, that these big kind of the machine learning processes, algorithm, which is supposed to be rendered neutral, which is supposed to be this new technology without human intervention, they're amplifying all the problems we have worldwide. They are not just amplifying racial bias and gender bias, they're also actually having like a literal manual labor happening under precarious condition in Venezuela, in Brazil, parts in Italy. There is this incredible study from Vladan Jolar and Matteo Paschinelli about it, so you have like this new technology and you render it like detached from human labor, but the labor is still happening. And I think this is something that happens in the middle of the work, where you see Chaplin in the assembly line, and it's actually something that they have called the assembly line of machine learning. So it continues to happen. So there is a perpetuation, there is a migration of those practices that go over and over and again. And the practice of invisibilizing has, been going on since capitalist societies, started. So I guess it's difficult to answer, very tightly about that. That's why the work, goes everywhere and tries to somehow, put it together, but it's very difficult.
No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. Somewhere in the work, the narrator says dictatorships are built on labor. And in a way, you know, that is one of the theses that the work puts forward. And I'm interested, what you've just been saying, I'm interested in how this work insists on a kind of material continuity between past modes of autocratic power and present modes. So, you know, extractivist models of the past and the way that neoliberal capital extracts value in the present. You know, we see Stalin and Hitler and Thatcher and Mobutu Sese Seko and Mussolini, all of the sort of dictators of excellence. Yeah. But you also very much locate this work, which after all was made in 2019, you're very much located in the Trump era. And so I think I'm right in saying that the sort of most contemporary footage or references would be references to the border wall of Trump. And you also reference this terrible incident in Charlottesville where you have the Nazis marching with torches in Charlottesville. So I'm interested in that kind of trajectory through the work from the past manifestations of power to the present.
Yes, I think there was a moment of crisis as well, because you know this very well from your own practice. You know, you're working on something and then there it comes reality and it just brings it doesn't bring it to shambles, but it really just keeps moving and you just have to, you know, cut up with it, you know, all the time. So the interesting thing was that 2018 when I kind of officially started working on the piece, because it was kind of commissioned, but I was already working on that before. But what happened there was actually many things coming together that year. One thing was actually the politics of Viktor Orban in Hungary. That was something incredibly interesting and fascinating in the wrong way, in the sense that the way they were targeting, the way Viktor Orban's policies and his party were targeting education, the way they were targeting like labor conditions. They were introducing this what they call the slave law. You know, it was called like that by the public in Hungary. But especially how they targeted education to proceed with that ethnical cleansing of the history, to have this revisionist ideas. In the one hand, they incepted chancellors going into the universities, you know, these funny, strange figures taking care of the finances in university, so they could control each department. And we know when you go into academia and you control the finances, you control the curriculum, you control what is taught, you control ideology, you control everything. So they did that. And then on top of cutting down all the money for universities and education, they built two new sort of universities, a new think tank that was completely devoted to revisionist ideologies, you know. And so the interesting thing, and then they started, and this is something that really caught my attention within all these news that were happening while I was working in the work, is that they started reprinting history books for high school. They let also people in high school, they were reprinting it to make deportation of Jewish people look like it was just a minor police incident. So they were reprinting all these things, and they were letting people in high school take tests on the new preamble on the Hungarian constitution that was saying something like, when you are a Hungarian national, you're a Christian. So, which we know that is actually not true. So all these things were happening and unfolding. And at the same time, Trump, fascist, white supremacist agenda was happening, you know, as you said yourself, Charlottesville, and all these things were happening, but also his propaganda about the wall, which was also super interesting in the sense that it was a propaganda about a wall that partly already existed. It was about this kind of idea, this kind of Uber idea about the wall being something that he was selling, because this is typical to ideology, you know, instead of dealing with the complexity of our times and telling the folk that this is the tensions that happen in capitalist societies, in the instability, it's just at the core of any capitalist society, you tell them there is a foreign intruder. So we have seen this happen over and over again. So Trump was doing just the same. At the same time, we also see that the wall that he was building or talking and the harsh policies that he was implementing were not just aiming at stopping people from crossing the border. They were aiming and putting those people in such precarious conditions that it could be exploited even more, because we know the United States needs that cheap labor. So we know all those things. And at the same time, I'm showing in the piece also the Malaya wall, the Malaya wire wall, which is this incredible, impressive 4-meter high razor wire on the top, that it has been funded by the European Union in an Africa, of course, in the African continent, but it's still Spanish, one of those paradigms, of Spanish enclaves and former colonies, so it's still Spanish, but it's financed by the European Union, that has more than hundreds of cameras. They have helicopters, they have people, the Guardia Civil in the side of Spain, they have people in the Moroccan border policing it and really treating the people. I mean, it's really insane what's happening over there. So I was trying to create like a connection between all of them without it being an obvious connection, but like being the connection of how we actually live in a democracy, but still we're inhabiting spaces and systems that are using the same type of policies that we have seen in totalitarian systems. So we look at autocratic Viktor Orban, yes, and Fidesz and his party, but let's look at the parties in Spain. Vox looks like Germany, AfD. Let's look at all those things and looks like at the Trump era, but even things that happened during the Obama time as well, which is also like another cup of tea, talking about Cuba and all these other things. I'm just saying that the connection is in there, and somehow the work is not there to explain all of it. And I am certainly not a historian, and I'm certainly don't have that type of target, but I try in the work by this kind of juxtaposing and this overlaying of images of all of them at the same time to make, understandable how this operates actually all the time, Sorry for the super long answers.
No. I think it's very tangible in the work. I think that despite all of this kind of this historical journey you take us on, ultimately one comes away from it feeling like this is a work that has a lot to say about the present moment. One of the really disturbing things that it suggests, and it traces this lineage back in time again, but it hints at the disposability of the human body. Towards the end of the work, this is stated quite directly. We start to see, artificial intelligences, the Chinese TV anchor, news anchor. We see Sophia, another artificial intelligence, a robot. But apart from that, the work is littered with bodies that are broken and fragmented and shattered. We see a doll, which is really an avatar for a human being, breaking. We see bodies on conveyor belts. We see eyes disconnected from heads. We see the dental model. The body is very much fragmented and broken, and I think that it's very much these broken bodies, you want us to understand them in relationship to the extraction of labor. And the way that the body is both necessary and obsolescent for contemporary or neoliberal modes of labor. So I was just curious, because that's another kind of very strong through line throughout the work, these fragments of bodies.
No, I think it's interesting that through the introduction of artificial intelligence and humanoid-looking robots, this type of I like to somehow play or like use this general fear towards new technologies, that are going to take our jobs, to hint at the mystification and propagation actually of those technologies, or for instance, artificial intelligence as being purely autonomous entities, completely detached from this human intervention. But at the same time, it is really such a good example of how we deal with disposability of bodies, and it's just like, the images that you're talking about, because people might know the work, might not have seen it, but reality is that the images that you're talking about, when you see these disposable bodies, like sometimes with members, completely dismembered in some way, they are coming from a Swedish science fiction drama series that was actually done, I think, in the 2000, maybe 2002, something like that, in Sweden. And it was a series that was actually quite interesting and quite avant-garde, in the sense that it was dealing with the possible rights and laws regulating our lives, our daily lives, with artificial intelligence. It was so much that these artificial intelligence, humanoid-looking robots were taking over, especially care jobs. They were taking the jobs in the domestic sphere. They were taking the jobs, literally jobs that traditionally have been subjected to the female, sort of capacity. And so the disposability of these bodies in connection of the disposability and the non-mournability, as Judith Butler puts it, this concept of those bodies that are not worth being mourned, those words that we can sacrifice, and that was super interesting to me to put it in connection to that. So this series called Real Humans brought so much actually into the mix. Actually, it is staged like in a way that you don't see all these implications, but you pretty much see these questions that we're still dealing with about, how we're supposed to live with these machines. I was also interested to play with the fact that when we have this fear about new technologies taking over our jobs, we should maybe think about, basic income. We should think about this, something that appears in the work very early on, like also that if we detach labor from income and we just redistribute, I know it's not as simple as that, but like if we redistribute the wealth that is already there, what can be liberated actually? And do we still need warfare? Do we still need this type of necropolitics, So in a way, it's all incredibly deeply connected already. You just have to look at it and start putting it together, and it just fits the whole picture. I think it's a little bit spooky sometimes, because as I told you, looking at modern times, reading Bifo Berardi's Soul at Work, reading or rereading Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, thinking about Ahil members, necropolitics, you just cannot believe it, how much it actually still fits the diagnostic of this society. So I think it comes at the end of the day, it goes back to the same place. So it's just like, yeah. I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah.
No, you did. And maybe I want to respond to that by saying that one of the other kind of interesting spaces in the work is the one that almost bridges things that we usually think of as inanimate objects and our subjective experience. So there are a lot of prostheses in the work. The dental model, these are prosthetic teeth, they're prosthetic limbs, and these are obvious prosthetics. But then the other prostheses, which are very prominent in the work, are things like iPhones, iPads, a mouse. These are also prosthetics. They're extensions of the body. And one thing that maybe sort of is a very dominant feature of contemporary capital is the radical extent to which our labor time, our time as producers of value, has been collapsed with and merged with our recreational time, our space of consumption, which of course is another space in which value is extracted from us. You trace this in the work all the way back to this very important piece of historical footage filmed by the Lumiere brothers at the Lumiere factory. But maybe you could comment on that, this kind of newly slick and almost chilling way in which these technical prosthetics, we sort of think that they're improving our lives and making us more productive, but to some extent they're also making us more and more beholden to systems of extraction.
Yes, the problem with some of them at least is that it's unthinkable to have them out of our lives anymore, because they have become not only technologies and devices that amplify and make possible for us to communicate. They also sometimes they have like a cognitive character, an emotional character to them, really like iPhones or like phones or mobile phones, smartphones, all these machines, these devices, they have become really prostheses as well. But they are not just an elongation of our bodies. They are an elongation of our way of thinking, how we construct language. Look at the whole, the whole system of the hashtagging, of the emojis, it has been completely changed, and it is no is not. The question is not to resist to it. The question is, as someone like Shoshana Zuboff, for instance, she speaks a lot about machines of affective, devices of affective, able to prognostic your feelings in order for selling a product to you. She talks about surveillance capitalism. I think it's really beautiful that you say something like that. It's the first time that I actually get that connection between the surplus that the workers walking out of the Lumiere factory produced by being extras, which is something I talk about in the piece, but I never saw it as a surplus. I saw it, of course, because I speak also about cognitive capitalism, but somehow it's interesting to see it one-on-one mirror towards the type of surplus that we produce by the data that we leave all the time. And I mean, I think a figure like Shoshana Zuboff, she is very important because she speaks about the extractivism of data and data surveillance, not from the things we are aware of what is being extracted, but actually what we are not aware. And the problem of all of this is not that is being used for commercial ends. It is, as we saw with the last elections and the ones before in the US, with Cambridge Analytica, we see that the real problem is when governments and this type of political institutions get on top of those data. The problem is that these data come from different places, and it builds a psychogram of who you are, because these devices have become machines of affective labor. They have become cognitive machines that we need, devices that we need in order to think and to propel and express ourselves. So they are so much part of an extension of our bodies, our minds, and our sentiments and emotions, that it's impossible to detach ourselves from them. So I don't think it's about putting them as a. I don't think it's about to try not to engage with them, but we need law regulations. We need something, data sovereignty. We need a lot of things actually in order to be going with this. And I think there is a direct connection to what you just said, actually, to this surplus that is produced by the Lumiere brothers, by the people working in the fabric of in the factory of the Lumiere brothers, and the type of surplus that we are all producing. Yes, there is. Wow.
Even those of us who have nothing, obviously that doesn't apply to us, but I'm just going to quote another line from the work, which says, "The colonized world is a world cut in two, held apart by barracks, by walls, by fences." And I'm struck by the fact that, you present to us as spaces of imprisonment, not only refugee camps and colonized territories, but you also mentioned gated communities. And, we see other environments of containment, such as the mass office, which looks so unassuming and almost elegant. We see this empty office with all of the very sort of stylish modernist furniture. But you seem to be implying that all of these spaces, they exist on a spectrum of oppression, not just the refugee camps, prisons, the mines, the sweatshops, but on the other hand, the gated community, for example, has to be understood as existing on that same spectrum. And to some extent, the existence of the gated community is very much indicative of the existence of these other spaces, which we usually think of as spaces of suffering, but they co-imply each other. And I was just interested in how you kind of looked at that whole range, the colonial logic from both sides of that spectrum.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the gate communities can only be whole there. It's not even a metaphor. It's maybe an allegory to what we were talking about all the time. The gate communities can only be whole in there. I don't think I look at them as a space always of detention, but I look as a space of separation. And that's what it is about, because a gated community is exactly that. It's a hierarchy. It's a place that separates yourself from something else. So at the end of the day, it's perpetuating this othering. There is that, and then there is an other. And so, depending on the side that you are in, it's a wall again, you know, we're talking about gated communities, it's the wall. So I don't see a huge difference between all those institutions, because they're all institutions of separation. They're keeping, they're producing labor also in the jails, you know, as we know, they're more and more privatized. You know, we have this huge problem of mass incarceration in the United States, you know, because it's also producing a lot, you know, it's really, you know, boosting the economy as well. So it's very convenient somehow, you know, to have it like that. But I see there is a direct connection to that. That's why they are included in the mix of all of those other institutions. It is actually institutions of separation. When we look at Venezuela, when we look at socialist countries that have very similar, you know, similar structures, you know, where you have like an upper class that is completely, as they say in German, die Schere geht auseinander, no? The scissors that goes even further away. It's if there is actually no middle, there's actually no connection in between. That's what it is about. It's about separation. And that also means maybe not detention, but it means isolation.
Right.
Which might be a very wealthy, you know, beautiful, you know, live one, you know, Kardashian style still.
Totally. To some extent, it implies a militarization, right? Because, yes. I mean, the reason that these gated communities and sort of privileged spaces are necessary is to protect those who have from those who might decide to rebel against their condition of not having.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm completely sure that in Calabasas, most people living there, you know, in LA, these very wealthy people, they don't have the Malaya fence, but they have something very similar. And, you know, the technologies are the same, and the type of, you know, the typography, the typology of how it's constructed is always the same. So yeah, there is actually a deep connection. And it's really kind of, you know, eye-opening to be reading, you know, texts about the results of colonial history in different places in the global south, and all of a sudden see yourself confronted with that type of construction in the global north, and understanding that incredibly intertwined and deep connection, the causality of the one with the other, you know, without wanting to make it too simplistic, because I don't want it to be placative or stupid, but it really is, you know. So it was very important in this sort of succinct small piece of work, you know, there is only 13 minutes to try to bring it in a way, and of course you caught it. Yes.
Well, I could ask you thousands more questions, actually.
Yes. It's crazy.
We've been talking already for 15 minutes, so I wonder if this.
Oh my God! Yes, let's open up.
To open up and see if there are questions for you about the work or about some of the points you've made. I think Katrin is going to be sort of fielding the questions.
Yes, moderating that.
Right. Yeah, that's right. There are not many questions or comments, but one I would like to read to you, a comment by Mutter Zwiebel, which says, "It sounds like you are painting your videos." This brings in an aspect of a question of maybe also representation, a question of course, it doesn't say more. So we are now kind
of... I'm painting.
Yeah, it sounds like you're painting your videos.
But that's very interesting to me, you know, because the thing is, like, I always say that I have no relationship to painting. And the funny thing is I was teaching a painting class for 2 years in Kassel, just by accident. Nobody painted there. I think 2 people painted, but and we talk about the paintings as well. So I have no relationship to that, to the painting in itself, but I understand in a sense about the composition. You know, it's about composition, of course, all the time, and it really is about constructing those images or deconstructing them in order then again to construct them back, you know. So I would say there is a relationship to that, but I will have to think a little bit deeper about it. But I never heard that, and I appreciate the question and the comment from our beloved Mutter Zwiebel.
And then there is something that came into my mind while you were talking about artificial intelligence. And I thought, well, maybe artificial intelligence is something or will be something like our new other. And will it help to, or may it help to unify us as humans, to focus on our kind of finally cross all those borders between, well, ethnical aspects and gender and age and I don't know, whatever there is, you know, that kind of does not unify us. Will we finally understand what we are as humans when we deal with artificial intelligence and humanoid robots and stuff like that?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not expert to that. You know, I think you can ask maybe someone like Hitosh Tayal. She might have more information on that. You know, I can only say that reality is that artificial intelligence is still being so much connected to military agencies and to companies. You know, being established in the global north. And we still have a huge problem with the introduction of bias. And so I don't think this inequity is going to be portrayed. I don't think this is going to be something that AI is going to do by itself, you know. So I do think that the human intervention in artificial intelligence or in machine learning, algorithm building, and all of that, these data sets that are being used for all of that, they are still in the hands of the people and of the places that they are. And I think as long as they are, I wouldn't know why they would have all of a sudden a change of, you know, heart and want to actually have more humanist and feminist ideas behind it. Unless there is a revolution like this series proposes, the Real Human series from Sweden actually is based on the plot that these robots at some point they just escape and they take the chip that they have out and they say we don't want to be part of we renounce labor and we renounce being owned by humans, which is, I mean, like you don't have to go far to think about how that sort of narrative appears, you know. And then they try to have like an almost anarchic sort of life, and they're called the anarchists also in the series, which is very delightful and very entertaining. So I don't quite recommend the series in the sense, but it really is full of moments where you can see you can see like scenarios that you could think about. That would be a possibility. But for that, artificial intelligence and algorithm or machine learning would have to be really autonomous. And it's not. That's just the reality of it. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but yeah.
I see. So two more comments. One, Mutter Zwiebel explained that she wrote that when you spoke about editing, the painterly aspect, but there's another question about editing. If you edit for 1.5 years, how do you decide that the piece is finished? That's a question by Nachrichten aus der Zivilisation.
Yes, mostly I have a deadline. But in the case of this work, it didn't help at all, because the piece was commissioned, and I have to actually give kudos to the institution, you know, that the Kunsthaus NRW, Cornelie Münster and Marcel, especially the director, and Elke Kania, actually, that were supporting the project from the very inception of it. Actually, it came out of a conversation we're having together. We realized we're researching on the same topic, and then they just supported me like that. It was very easy. They let me also very free, but I also didn't meet the deadline of the opening of the show, and there was actually this work that had been commissioned for that, and I was on the verge of a complete burnout, I have to say, so which was actually fitting the work so well. So somehow I was so in sync with what I was doing, and reality is that I finished it for the end of the exhibition. It was well. I don't know when you know that it's finished, but the reality is that I had the feeling when I finished the piece that there were so many things I couldn't really focus on. So I did another piece, the excitement of ownership, because I didn't talk especially about female labor and also the connection between extractivist processes and violence against female or female identified bodies. So all of a sudden I had to do another piece that was a complete other piece. I did it for the Kunstmuseum Bonn actually as a commission as well. And it was like this piece, like trying to focus on that, because I had the feeling in this piece I couldn't even bring underneath everything that I just actually wanted to talk about. And then another piece came out last year called Not Gone with the Wind, where I again go also into some things, and of course it's shaped by the contemporary times we're in. So I guess you're never finished, really. You just have sometimes deadlines. Also, you have sometimes the feeling that you have to understand that you cannot ask for this little beautiful work to do everything, you know. You can ask for it to do this, and then you just carry some of that thought material. I always think that it sounds a bit generic, but after the work is always before the work, you know, artistic work. You know, I always have the feeling that the pieces, they kind of manage sometimes to summarize and to bring out something that is really dearly important for you, but at the same time, they can't just do that. And then you just move on, and you're happy they were in your life, they were there to witness it, you know, we're part of this construction and this learning process, but then you just gotta move on, and then everything, you know, comes into place, but connected to that. So, yeah.
I see. So I have here one last question by Mrs. Joy Satch. She's asking, what's your approach in use of found footage? Is the material all free for you as opposed to the praxis of straight documentary filmmakers? So there is obviously the idea of a distinction between a documentary practice that would not include found footage.
Yes, I guess I was lucky enough to early on not to be able to work with this so many different types of material. I came from so many different sources, and yeah, in documentary filmmaking you might not as much, also because it's mostly financed by television, so you have to look at, you know, a lot of other restrictions and possibilities of what you can use in terms of archive, and also the construction in the editing and the montage might be different. I don't make any difference, actually. I use the material always the same way, in the sense that, of course, when you have historical materials that are recognizable, or you have fiction films or whatever it is from the mainstream that has a certain type of recognizability and also an impact, you work with that maybe in a certain way, but there is actually no hierarchy going at it. All is material, or is, you know, the game, the play is open, the playground is open, and it's just about to see what lies behind these images, what lies behind all of that. I also have to say that the first thing that I do when I have a new project is I go through the hard drives of the last one, and then I look at it, and sometimes I reuse my own images that might be mine, that might be something I appropriated. So it really is all the time about looking under a new perspective at the same thing sometimes, and see how you can load it with different meaning, with a different purpose, and that's just how it goes. So I am really extremely free and unhierarchical when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I think we had a very interesting and inspiring hour. Thank you very much, Eli, for giving us an insight in your way of thinking and your way of dealing with video art. And also thanks to Candice for asking the questions that made Eli really think and talk. And yeah, thanks everyone who joined us, and have a nice rest of the evening.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Mm-hmm.